everybody. Very nice to see all of you tonight. My name is Vicki McCaffrey. I'm the events coordinator here at Central. Last Thursday, we were really fortunate to have Adam Johnson join us. This week, we are equally fortunate to have Blaine Harden here with us to talk about his book, Escape from Camp 14. We are so lucky to have authors of this caliber visit with us in Arlington. These programs are made possible through the generous support of the Friends of the Library. If you are not yet a member of the Friends, I encourage you to join so you can help support programs like this and show your commitment to reading, learning, and community. While Mr. Johnson was here, he commented last week that the cruelest psychological experiment on earth is currently taking place in North Korea. Mr. Harden's book, The True Story of a Young Man Born into North Korean Gulag, who eventually escapes that fate, certainly illustrates that point for the reader. Mr. Harden's book has been widely praised and is currently a New York Times bestseller. The Christian Science Monitor said of the book, "A book without parallel, Escape from Camp 14 is a riveting nightmare that bears witness to the worst in humanity, an unbearable tragedy magnified by the fact that the horror continues at this very moment without an end in sight." As we continue our look inside North Korea, please join with me in welcoming Blaine Harden to Arlington County.
All right. Am I heard? Oh, good. It's an honor to be back in Arlington. I lived here in the 80s and came to this library all the time. And I'm thrilled to be back here as a speaker. So what I'd like to do is two things, is tell you a bit about North Korea and what makes it unique and what makes it worthy of our attention. And then talk about the story that is the heart of my book, the story of Shin Donghyuk, who he is and what kind of person he grew up to be, having been born and bred in a political labor camp in North Korea. Let me start with what is going to be a very, very accelerated primer on what North Korea is. It's a totalitarian state, and these are pretty rare beasts around the world. Right now, there's just North Korea, and usually they don't last too long, as you can see. But North Korea is still there and still functioning very much as it's functioned for decades. And this is also unusual because most of these states tend to disappear when the leader dies. That was certainly the case in Germany and in Stalin's Russia, Stalin's Soviet Union. But North Korea has managed to have two changes of leadership. And the most recent is we're all very familiar with what happened in December of last year when Kim Jong-il died. And all of a sudden, there was another great leader. Kim Il-sung died in 1994. His son took over, and his son died last year, as I said. And the new leader, 28 years old, and who he is and what he thinks is still very much a question mark. And it's a question mark whether he's actually in control of the country or not. I think it's going to take at least a couple more years to get a sense if he is going to take the country in a different direction. So far, there's no indication at all that that is happening. He came to the job without the preparation of his father. His father had years to prepare. But Kim Jong-il had a stroke a couple years earlier, and then Kim Jong-un was named as the successor in waiting, and then he took over, and it's still a question mark. But what's more interesting is how does North Korea survive as a totalitarian state? And the answer is, I think, fairly simple. There are 4 or 5 legs on which these states all stand. And North Korea did not invent totalitarianism. It's just that they've managed to stick it out longer than anybody else. And to have this kind of state, you have to have a stranglehold on information, which they have had, but that's weakening. There are new reports, US government finance reports, that the access to radios in North Korea has increased dramatically. CDs, DVDs. I interviewed a young man who learned about the United States from watching James Bond movies and Charlie Angel's DVDs. And they have been coming in regularly. Sometimes you can order them from China for more than 10 years, since the late 1990s. So the stranglehold on information is weakening. In 1989, at the end of the year, when the Ceausescu regime was overthrown in Eastern Europe, I was covering Eastern Europe at the time and was one of the first reporters to go into Romania after the fall of the government there. And I, along with all the other reporters, went out and talked to the Romanian people and said, well, what did you know? What do you know about the world? Because they were thought to be pretty isolated. But in fact, they knew everything because they'd been listening to the radio. They knew exactly what had happened in that pivotal year, 1989, from Poland on through then Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Germany. They knew the whole story, and they'd been listening to it several hours a day. My wager is that in North Korea, there is now a very large number of people who understand what's going on in the rest of the world, particularly in Northeast Asia, because the place is being bombarded with signals from Radio Free Asia and from South Korean government, US supported in various ways. And the signals are really strong in North Korea, and access to radio is wide. So the stranglehold on information is weakening. And the control of the economy also is weakening dramatically. In the late 1990s, there was a severe famine. The economy had been basically held together by subsidies from the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the system of subsidies collapsed. There was a famine also related to drought, and 1 million people starved to death in North Korea in the late 1990s. The first such major famine in an industrialized country in history. But what it did, in the course of that famine, the government's ability to provide food through a central distribution system, it collapsed. What took over for the economy of North Korea, such as it is a scruffy system of markets, of smugglers, of people who are paying bribes to secret police, who are stealing goods from the government, whatever the government has, but mostly they're siphoning goods out of cooperative farms and smuggling goods in from China. So the state does not control the economy anymore. The economy is this sort of free-form mess that rents are extracted from it by secret police demanding bribes from traders. But the economy is a kind of free market. Very rudimentary, but still it's different. But a couple of the legs of the totalitarian state are still incredibly robust. The military is huge, 1.2 million people out of 23 million people in the country. Almost everybody serves in the military for a long time, 7 to 10 years. Secret police is everywhere, and the concentration camps, or the political labor camps, call them what you will. These camps are known by the North Korean population. Surveys of defectors have found that an overwhelming majority of these defectors are aware of the camp's existence, and they know what would lead you to go there. They are an instrument of fear. But also keeping North Korea alive is China. China has geopolitical reasons for having a buffer with a US allied South Korea. And to keep that buffer functioning, it does all this stuff. It supplies all the crude oil, 3/4 of the imports. Without China, North Korea would probably not be able to function. It doesn't function very well as it is. A third of the population is chronically hungry, according to the World Food Program. And stunting from malnutrition is very widespread. People who come from North Korea to South Korea, and there are now more than 23,500 North Koreans in South Korea, almost all of whom have come in the past 12 years. They arrive, if young men arrive, about 5 inches shorter than their South Korean counterparts, which is an incredible height difference. And before the division of North and South Korea, North Koreans were often taller. So the nutritional situation in North Korea is catastrophic for a significant percentage of the population and has been for a long time. But fear also is one of the reasons that North Korea persists as this kind of state. Kim Il-sung, the great leader, the founding dictator of the country, he said this in relation to the political labor camps and who would go. To translate this into English, if I insult Kim Jong-un, say he's fat and ugly and stupid in a public forum, I would have a good chance of going to a political labor camp along with my children and my parents. And we would all go for the rest of our lives and work until we died. That's the system. And it has been around for a long time compared to other camps of these kinds that have been known. As you can see, twice as long as the Soviet Gulag, 12 times as long as the Nazi death camps. To be clear, North Korea's labor camps are not death camps. People are not systematically executed when they arrive. They are worked to death over time. Surveys of defectors who've been in the camps, and there are now more than 60 who've told their stories in depth to human rights investigators. The normal trajectory of life in the camps is to be there until your late 40s, at which time you die from malnutrition-related illnesses, but not before you lose your teeth, your gums turn black, and you hunch over from malnutrition-related deficiencies for bones and that sort of thing. So life in the camps is awful grim. And what has the West done about it? The United States and Europe and basically nothing, maybe overstating it. Maybe it should be not much. I've talked to 2 diplomats who spent a good part of their professional lives meeting with North Koreans or planning to meet with North Koreans or hoping to meet with North Koreans about nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. And in their meetings, they almost never bring up human rights or the camps. And if they do, that's the line that both of these diplomats told me. The North Koreans go nuts and walk out of the room. And because the United States has intermittently wanted to talk to the North Koreans about these existential threats of nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, the North Koreans have sort of got away with pushing human rights off the table. They still officially deny that these political labor camps exist, even though they can be easily seen on satellite images in high resolution now. So what is stopping us from taking a more robust attitude towards this human rights catastrophe that's gone on for virtually all our lives, all the lifetimes of everybody in this room, just about? Well, North Korea has some military muscle. The important part of that muscle is the short and medium range missiles, which they've developed quite a number of. They could really hit Seoul and Tokyo with scores of missiles in very short notice. There are anti-ballistic systems set up, anti-missile systems set up in Tokyo, but most experts agree that they would not stop North Korea if they fired a lot of short-range, medium-range missiles at the same time. And the development of long-range missiles continues. There was a failed missile launch just a few weeks ago. And their ability to hit Seattle or San Francisco is on the drawing room, it's in planning right now. It's not clear that they can do it. They do have 2 crude nuclear weapons that they've detonated. They have more that they may detonate. Their ability to missileize their nuclear weapons is considered not yet existent. So the existential threat to the United States from North Korea, it's not there yet at this point. But the real threat, the thing that keeps North Korea alive as far as South Korea is concerned and the US military presence in South Korea is artillery. They have an enormous number of artillery tubes dug in on the north side of the DMZ. And there are thousands of them. They could devastate Seoul with a population of more than 20 million in about 4 minutes. It would take these shells to get there. Former CIA officials that I've talked to who are cognizant of the most government estimate that tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people could be killed in Seoul if there was an all-out military strike. And there's very little that US military in South Korea or the South Korean military could do to stop it. So this extortion has gone on for a long time. They are in a position to say, if we feel threatened, we may go down, but the price would be very, very high in Seoul. South Korea is now the 11th, 12th largest economy in the world. In many ways, it's the most modern of the Asian countries, the most ambitious, the fastest growing. It's an extraordinary place. And the last thing they want is an artillery attack on Seoul. So they put up with a lot from North Korea. So, safe from the outsiders, the camps can basically operate as they want. I don't know why that's there. The inmate population of the camps is now estimated at between 135,000 and 150,000 in 5 camps, all of which are clearly visible on your smartphones after this talk. If you want to get out the camps, you go to Google Earth, you can see the camps. And a lot of the camps have been annotated. The subject of my book, Shin Donghyuk, has annotated Camp 14, where he was born and raised. And you can see where his mother was executed and other places in the camp. The number of people who died in the camps are estimated by human rights groups at 400,000. And Amnesty International, monitoring those satellite photographs, found evidence of new construction last year. Whether that means more prisoners, better places for the guards to live, or new factories in the camps, it's not clear. The camps are big. Camp 14, which you'll hear more about, it's about 30 miles long and 15 miles wide. It's a big place. So the camps tend to be in the mountainous parts of the country, remote areas, cold areas in the winter particularly. Camp 14, I guess I can walk over there. This is where Shin was born and raised. It's since this map was made 2 years ago, Camp 18 and 14 have joined together in one Uber camp, and I don't know what the number of that is. And Camp 15, which you see there, is called Yodok. And that's a camp where almost all of the eyewitnesses from the camps have come from. People went to Yodok. There was a rehabilitation zone in Yodok for a number of years where people could go spend between 2 and 10 years. And it was really tough, but people would leave. And some people, more than 50 actually, after they left, they managed to escape North Korea through China and find their way to South Korea and told stories about Yodok. As far as Camp 14 is concerned, escapes were not very common. In fact, the number of inmates known to escape from this gulag, which has existed since the late 50s, is 3. That's the total number of known people. Maybe others have escaped and just kept their mouths shut. And the total number of inmates born in the camp, raised in the camp, known to escape, is 1. And it's the guy that is the subject of my book, Shin Donghyuk. He's now 29. And let me just read a couple things from my book to give you a sense of how his story is just utterly different from other stories of camp survivors that you may be familiar with from the literature of the Holocaust or from the Soviet era. In stories of concentration camp survival, there is a conventional narrative arc. Security forces steal the protagonist away from a loving family and a comfortable home. To survive, he abandons moral principles, suppresses feelings for others, and ceases to be a civilized human being. In perhaps the most celebrated of these stories, Night, by Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel, the 13-year-old narrator explains his torment with an account of the normal life that existed before he and his family were packed aboard trains bound for Nazi death camps. Wiesel studied the Talmud every day. His father owned a store and watched over their village in Romania. His grandfather was always around to talk to the boy about his faith, about the Jewish holidays, about the tradition of the family. But after Wiesel's entire family perished in the camps, he was left alone. He wrote that he was alone, terribly alone in a world without God, without man, without love or mercy. Shin's story of survival is different. His mother beat him, and he viewed her as a competitor for food. His father, who was allowed by guards to sleep with his mother just 5 nights a year, ignored him. His brother was a stranger. Children in the camp were untrustworthy and abusive. Before he learned anything else as a human being, Shin learned to survive by snitching on all of them. Love and mercy and family were words without meaning. God did not disappear or die. Shin had never heard of him. In a preface to Night, Wiesel wrote that an adolescent's knowledge of death and evil should be limited to what one discovers in literature. In Camp 14, Shin did not know literature existed. He saw only one book in the camp, a Korean grammar in the hands of a teacher who wore a guard's uniform, carried a revolver on his hip, and beat one of his primary school classmates to death with a chalkboard pointer. Unlike those who have survived a concentration camp, Shin had not been torn away from a civilized existence and forced to descend into hell. He was born and raised there. He accepted its values. He called it home. And that was the situation of his life until he was 23, which is just incredible. And it took me a long time in my conversations with Shin, which went on for about 2.5 years, to understand what that means, to have a total lack of love, trust, family, loyalty, trust particularly in your life. It's almost incomprehensible to understand, so it's difficult to interview someone like that because you don't know what their frame of reference is. So he was raised in the camp. His parents were chosen by the guards, were selected by the guards to breed. Very much like hogs in a hog confinement unit, which is what big hog farms are called in Iowa. And he was the result of that union. His parents did not have too much affection for each other or for him. He went to school in a school not far from the place where he lived with his mother until he was 12. And the school taught him how to read at a rudimentary level and how to add and subtract. He never learned how to multiply. And to this day, he does not know how to multiply. The diet was grim. Corn, cabbage, and salt mixed in a kind of gruel for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's the only thing he ate provided by the camp for 23 years. He supplemented it with rats and mice and whatever they could find in the camp. Sometimes berries, sometimes good things to eat, but mostly he was hungry all the time. And hunger was the defining motivation in his life for virtually everything. When he was 13, and this is the real heart of my book, something terrible happened to him. He went home when he was 12, he went to a boarding school in the camp. He didn't live with his mother, but he occasionally saw her. One Friday night, he was allowed to go home and stay at his mother's place. His older brother was there. He ate dinner with them. He went to sleep. At midnight, he heard his mother and brother talking. Their conversation awakened him. He heard them talk about escape. In this camp, there were really 10 commandments, and the first 2 said, if you try to escape, you will be shot immediately. If you hear someone talking about escape and you fail to report it, you'll be shot immediately. He heard this word escape. He got up, told his mom that he had to go pee. He left her house, went and found a guard, and snitched out his mother and brother. The guard told him to go back to the school and go to sleep. He would take care of it. The next morning, his mother and brother were taken away from their place to an underground prison inside the camp, a place that Shin had not known existed. To his bad luck was that the guard that he had snitched to failed to report to his superiors that it was Shin who betrayed his family. Shin was also taken that morning to that underground facility. He was utterly confused why he was being taken to a prison because he had done what he was supposed to have done, which is report the escape. While he was there, when he was 13, he was tortured, asked about what he knew and what he was going to do if he escaped. He couldn't figure out why they were asking him because he'd been the person who'd turned in his family. So he didn't answer for a couple days. He was just utterly confused and terrified. And after he got burned, he was in extraordinary pain. But after a few days, he managed to persuade them that, in fact, he was the person who had been the informant. There was somebody else who corroborated his story. So but he stayed underground for 7 months, and then his family was taken out to a place in the camp where Shin had often gone to see executions. He was taken in a blindfold, didn't know where he was going. When the blindfold was taken off, he thought that he was going to be executed. But what happened was his mother and his brother his mother was hanged and his brother was shot in front of him. This is when he turned 14. And Shin told me about this in our first lunch. And one of the things he said is that he was glad that his mother was killed. He hated her. He was very angry at her for having plotted an escape, which led to his torture and great pain for him. He had no real feeling for her in any way that any of us would understand. When Shin told me that, and I first wrote about him, I couldn't come to grips with it as a reporter. I had been a reporter for, 26 years, 27 years when I heard this story. But I went back to Shin and got him to cooperate in this book, and then over the next 2.5 years, I came to understand his thinking. And what happened after that betrayal and after the death of his mother, he went back to school in the camp. He worked at a dam, hydroelectric dam. He worked at a pig farm. And when he was 22, he was assigned to a uniform factory where he fixed sewing machines. This terrible thing that happened when he was 13 and 14 began to fade from his life, and he just figured that he would spend the rest of his life in the camp. And he had no real concept of what the world was like beyond barbed wire. And what's more interesting, no curiosity, none, about what was out there. It just didn't enter his mind to think about it. He was concerned about getting food. But when he was in this uniform factory, he was assigned to work with an older guy, a guy named Park, a man who was a newcomer to Camp 14 and who had grown up in Pyongyang, had gone to school in the former Soviet Union, and who had traveled around the world. Park was a sophisticated North Korean, a former member of the elite. And he joined Shin in this factory. Shin's job was to teach this guy how to fix sewing machines. And they only spent about 2 months together. And they talked about sewing machines for a while, but you can only talk about sewing machine repair for so long. And then Park started to talk about life outside the camp. Shin was reluctant to listen, but he got interested. And Shin was under orders from the guards because Shin had been a reliable snitch throughout his life in the camp. He was under orders to snitch on Park, to tell the superiors whatever Park had to say about the leadership in Pyongyang, about any known plotters in Pyongyang. But instead of snitching, Park made this incredible decision to listen to the guy. And let me read you a little bit about what Shin learned and how it utterly remade the wiring in his brain in just a few weeks. So began a month-long one-on-one seminar that would forever change Shin's life. As they walked the factory floor, Park told Shin that the giant country next door was called China. Its people were rapidly getting rich. He said that in the South there was another Korea. In South Korea, he said, everyone was already rich. Park explained the concept of money. He told Shin about the existence of television and computers and mobile phones. He explained that the world was round, which was news to Shin. Much of what Park talked about, especially at the beginning, was difficult for Shin to understand, believe, or care about. Shin wasn't especially interested in how the world worked. What delighted him, what he kept begging Park for, were stories about food and eating, particularly when the main course was grilled meat. Park described the enchantments of chicken, pork, and beef in China, Hong Kong, Germany, England, and the former Soviet Union. The more Shin listened to these stories, the more he wanted out of the camp. He ached for a world where an insignificant person like himself could walk into a restaurant and fill his stomach with rice and meat. He fantasized about escaping with Park because he wanted to eat like Park. Intoxicated by what he heard from the prisoner he was supposed to betray, Shin made perhaps the first free decision of his life. He chose not to snitch. Shin's decision to honor Park's confidences did not signify new insight into the nature of right and wrong. Looking back, Shin views his behavior as fundamentally selfish. Park's stories were much more valuable to him than what he could have received by turning Park in. They had become an essential and energizing addiction, changing his expectation about the future and giving him the will to plan for it. He believed he would go mad without hearing more stories from Park. In his reports to the superintendent, Shin found himself telling a wonderfully liberating lie. Park, he said, had absolutely nothing to say. So instead of snitching, they started plotting together to escape. And their plan to escape was incredibly lame. Their plan was to find a way to get close to the high voltage fence that surrounds the camp and climb through it and run off. That was it. It was basically the only option that they had. On January 2nd, 2005, a day that the uniform factory was closed for the New Year's holiday, they closed it for 2 days. The workers from the factory were sent up to the woods to chop wood. And when I say up to the woods, they went up to on a mountain ridge near the fence. And Shin knew that area. He had worked there before. He knew that it was hard for the guard towers to have a line of sight shot at those going through the fence. It was sort of hidden there. And they're also being, their minder that day was a prison warden, somebody who was a prisoner, but who was their sort of capo, and he didn't have a weapon. At dusk, they decided to make a run for it. Shin grabbed Park's hand and said, "Let's go." They ran towards the fence. Shin was to have been the inside man on this escape because he knew the camp. But he slipped in the snow and fell on his face. Park got to the camp first. He thrust his torso through the bottom wire and the next wire up, pulled the wire down, and the voltage from the fence killed Park almost immediately. But he also, as he fell to the ground, he grounded some of the voltage. Shin did not hesitate, and he says, "I don't know why I did this." He just crawled over his body. And he got most of the way through the fence. His lower legs slipped off of Park's torso on both sides, and he got really severe electrical burns on both legs from knees to ankles. It basically ripped open his shins, and he still has just unbelievable scarring there. But he got through, he was not electrocuted, and he ran off. In the escape plan, the outside guy, outside the fence, was to have been Park. Shin did not know where north was. He did not know where China was. He'd recently learned that the world was round. He didn't have a clue about what to do. But he's a very, very smart, cunning survivor. Just incredibly intelligent. What he did is he ran off, found some cover, some woods, ran through that, and after about an hour and a half, he found an old barn. North Korea is the most militarized country on earth. There are a lot of old military uniforms in that country. He knocked the door off this sort of buried shed. It was out in a field, it was like a farmer's shed. And he found an old uniform in there, changed out of his clothes, changed his shoes, he found an old book of some sort and wrapped tore out some pages and wrapped those around his bleeding legs. And then he ran off some more and found his way into a town called Chang, which is very close to the camp. He came in at night in this uniform. I told you that he'd worked in a pig farm. He smelled a pigsty, and he went and found a place to sleep in the pigsty, covered himself up with some straw, and slept through the night. It's very cold in January in the mountains in North Korea. He woke up in the morning, his legs were killing him, he hadn't eaten for a while. In my interviews with Shin, I always ask him, and so do other people who meet him for the first time, is what's the most wonderful thing about being out of the camp? Is it being in the United States? Is it technology? Is it Jesus Christ? What is it that is for you the most exciting, the most memorable, the most meaningful part about not being a prisoner anymore? And he told me the answer like 10 times before I actually listened and had him elaborate. But for him, it was that first morning of waking up in Chang. And let me read just... So he woke up and then he wandered around in this town without any food, without any friends, without a clue about what to do with the rest of his life, and worried that somebody was after him. For the next 2 days, Shin scavenged around the outskirts of Chang, eating whatever he could find on the ground or in garbage heaps. He had no idea what to do or where to go. People in the street seemed to ignore him because he was wearing a military uniform and he was skinny and dirty. It was a look that in North Korea does not attract a lot of attention. His legs hurt and he was hungry and cold, yet he was exhilarated. He felt like an alien fallen to earth. In the months and years ahead, Shin would discover all things modern, streaming video, blogs, and international air travel. Therapists and career counselors would advise him. Preachers would show him how to pray. Friends would teach him how to brush his teeth, use a debit card, fool around with a smartphone. From obsessive reading online, the politics, history, and geography of the two Koreas, China, Southeast Asia, Europe, and the United States would all snap into place. None of this, though, did more to change his understanding of how the world works and how human beings interact with each other than his first days outside that camp. It shocked him to see North Koreans going about their daily lives without having to take orders from guards. When they had the temerity to laugh, or wear brightly colored clothes, or haggle over prices in the open-air market, he expected armed men to step in, knock heads, and stop this nonsense. The word Shin uses again and again to describe those first few hours is shock. It was not meaningful to him that North Korea in the dead of winter is ugly, dirty, and dark, or that it is poorer than Sudan, or that taken as a whole, it is viewed by human rights groups as the world's largest prison. His context had been 23 years in an open-air cage run by men who hanged his mother, shot his brother, crippled his father, murdered pregnant women, beat children to death, taught him to betray his family, and tortured him over a fire. He felt wonderfully free, and as best as he could determine, no one was looking for him. In fact, as far as he knows, no one ever did look for him. He never found anybody. He never saw anybody looking for him. So this is his unlikely escape path. 370 miles in about a month. From Chang, he walked around Chang the first few days, broke into a house, found some more clothes, a warm winter coat, the warmest coat he'd ever seen. The guards wore warm coats, but the warmest thing he'd ever worn in his life. And he found a large bag of rice and a knapsack. He put the bag of rice in the knapsack and walked past the market. And a market lady shouted at him, "What's in the bag, kid?" And he had heard from Park that things are sold for money, and he'd seen people at the market exchanging goods, and he'd seen this money, but he'd actually never touched money or been involved in a financial transaction. But he sold the rice for the equivalent of $4, $6 or something like that. He had no idea if he was getting a good deal because it was his first experience in any financial transaction. And he bought some crackers and cookies with that money, and then he walked out of town. On the way out of town, he saw some men walking along who looked about as bedraggled as him, and he asked where they were going, and they said they were going north towards China. They were traders. They were part of this scruffy free market economy that I described. So he walked along. He walked to Mangsen, this is right here, and this is not far, about a day, and he managed to get on a truck there. Part of the economy of North Korea now is to take state-owned equipment and lease it for corrupt officials to use state-owned equipment to make money. And so they pile a bunch of stragglers on a truck and drive them across the country and charge them a bit. And he got on the truck, paid a little bit of money, and found his way over to the coast, and then got on a train and went north. And in 30 days, he was out of the country. To cross the border, he was incredibly lucky. His whole escape, besides being smart and tough, he was insanely lucky. When he got to the border is intermittently permeable, depending on the politics of the region at the time and who you manage to see. But the guards there are quite used to traders going back and forth and taking bribes from them. Shin gave them cigarettes, cookies, candy, and said he'd be back with more goods for one guard. And then he walked across the Tumen River, which is this small little river, into China. It took him a year and a half then to find his way to South Korea after going through China. So I won't talk about China so much. I'll answer questions if you have questions about that. I met Shin in Seoul in 2008, and we started working on this project, which he didn't want to do because he hated all reporters, because he's a very paranoid individual. But he did talk to me for a Washington Post story, which attracted a huge amount of attention from people who wanted to help Shin. A lot of folk in the United States sent money and prayers, and in fact, one couple from Columbus, Ohio ended up sort of adopting Shin and provided money for him to come to the United States. And he lived in Southern California for 2 years, moving there in 2009 after our interview. Here we are. This is just before we went into Louis Vuitton to buy some fancy clothes. He lived in Southern California in a place called Torrance, working for LINK, Liberty in North Korea, which is a human rights group based in the United States. And he did that. He spent some time in Seattle. He spent some time in Washington. Now he's back in Seoul. So this is where Shin is now. Interviews, we've done a lot of interviews since this book came out, he and I, and the interviews are torment for him. He does it because he wants the message to get out. He did the book because he wants people to know what happened to him, what is happening to his friends still in that camp. But he's not a good patient who does what he's told. What I want him to do, what friends want him to do, in the United States, which was to become a successful Korean American, of whom there are so many. Education, find a good job, but he just, as you see, he won't do psychotherapy, formal education, and when people give him advice, he has a hard time distinguishing between well-meant constructive criticism and utter betrayal. And then this is something he told me when we were coming to the end of the reporting for the book, but it's something he still repeats. He said a few weeks ago that he thinks it'll take about 16 more years to figure out how to be a human being. We went to Europe together, and the French were very interested in Shin as a case, the rights of man. What is a human being? What is a human being who doesn't really know some of the basic emotional architecture of humanity until you're 23? What kind of man are you? They kept asking him. And he says, I'm not much of a man. I don't know, I'm trying. It was very difficult for him. Okay, let me answer whatever questions you have. A human rights group, the committee the U.S. Committee on Human Rights in North Korea, which is based here in the Washington area. They wanted me to meet him. Shin had talked to journalists. He had written a short book in 2007 that no one had paid any attention to in South Korea. And he'd done a round of interviews with some international media and media in newspapers in South Korea. But for some reason, his story had not registered. And so I said it sounded very interesting. And my job for the Post was to try to put a human face on what goes on inside North Korea. So I heard about him and I went and did the interview. And it was by far the best story that I wrote about Korea for the Washington Post. And it got me all excited. And this is a human story, a way to shine a light on these camps. And he was finally persuaded to participate in the book. Not so much because of my persuasive charms, but because human rights groups told him, do this and you'll get your story to a very large audience in the United States and around the world. And we think that this guy can be trusted. And over time, he did come to trust me. And also, we split the revenues from the books and whatever else comes from the book. And he is broke and without relatives. And that was attractive to him as well. And that's why we struck up this strange partnership, which has actually turned out to be pretty friendly now. But just until 3 months ago, I wouldn't have described him as my friend, because getting him to talk is so difficult. And I constantly pushed him farther than he wanted to go. And I use the image in the book of dentistry without anesthetics. And he dreaded coming to the interviews. I dreaded the interviews too, because he just looked so pained. But he did, in the end, tell me all of his story. I guess the two things I should mention that I didn't, at least I think I didn't mention yet, is how do I know that Shin's story is true? Because it's not verifiable. And it's a good question, and I'll try to do my best to explain how I think it's true. I mentioned these scars on his body, on his legs, on his back. He had a finger partially cut off by a guard when he dropped a sewing machine, and sure enough, his finger is missing. And he has some other scars on his ankles from where he was hung upside down in that underground prison. So all the scarring on his body, which is just horrific, it all matches up with his story. So I spent a lot of time looking at his body without clothes on to verify. So that's one way. The second way is that there is a really large body of testimony now from former camp inmates about what life is like in the camps. And many of those individuals have been interviewed by the same person, a guy named David Hawk, who has written a book called Hidden Gulag, which came out 10 years ago, and it came out again this year with more interviews. And he's also interviewed Shin. And he could put Shin in the continuum of these 60 other individuals who've been in the camps and other camps in the country. And so he really could see if Shin's story was congruent with the way they told the story, if his affect was the same. And it is. And the South Korean government thinks it's true, and so do, I interviewed 4 camp survivors myself in depth about their lives and about Shin, and they know Shin. And they found him to be believable. He's also stunted from malnutrition, and his arms are bowed from childhood labor. He has done annotations of Camp 14, saying this is where my mother was killed, this is where I went through the fence, this is where I was hit by rocks from the guards' children, this is where I worked in the dam. And I've gone through in granular detail using Google Earth the contours of the camp, and his story really is consistent with the geography of the place as it's been annotated. And other annotations of other camps, it's very consistent. All the camps seem to work in exactly the same way. And then the satellite images of all the other camps keeps coming in, and it's more and more detailed. And it's consistent with the witness testimony. So that's why I think it's true. But there's one other thing that I don't think I mentioned. I had a lecture this morning, and I think I may be running them together. But Shin lied to me in a very fundamental way, as he lied to everybody in South Korea about his life. And it's at the heart of the book, too, along with this. It involves this incident with his mother and her death and the escape. When he first came to South Korea, he told the story that he witnessed his mother's execution and the brother's execution for attempting to escape. But he made no mention at all that he had ratted them out. And it was a very deliberate decision on his part, because he didn't want to be punished by the South Korean police, the intelligence people who initially debriefed him when he arrived. And he didn't want to be shunned by South Koreans who would think, and his language to me when he finally told me about this was, I didn't want them to think that I was a monster. So he lied to the authorities in South Korea. He lied to many, many journalists. He lied in his book. He wrote a short book about his experiences. And he only told me, because he'd been in Southern California for about 1.5 years, and he was surrounded by people who he finally had come to trust, and who he knew had his best interests at heart. And he just felt, and the other really important thing is he'd come to realize what a terrible thing he'd done to his mother, because he's sort of, in an ex post facto way, he was learning about morality and what the relationship should be between a mother and son in a family, or trust between friends. All of these things were foreign concepts to him. And as he came to grips with him, the guilt of having told this lie, he said, I have to tell you that I was one of those bad people in the camp, and this is what I did to my own mother. And I was utterly shocked when he told me. I just didn't expect it. Yes?
I'm curious about how he got from northern China to, I guess it was South Korea. Yeah. And how long did he reside there, and when did he get to be introduced to the West, and you in particular?
Okay. Well, when he crossed the border, it took him just a couple days. When you cross the border, it's not like you're going into a completely foreign country. There are lots of ethnic Chinese, ethnic Koreans who live along that border. They've been there for a couple hundred years for various historical reasons. So a Korean-speaking person who wanders across that border is not entering, it's not like going to Southern California. People speak Korean, they eat Korean food, they've seen a lot of North Koreans. That border had been flooded by maybe 400,000 North Koreans crossing that border since the famine times in the late 1990s when he crossed 2005. So he wandered across the border. He found a Korean-speaking ethnic Chinese pig farmer, pigs played a big role in his early life, who offered him a job. He said, look, I'll pay you nothing, or the equivalent of like 50 cents a day or something, and I'll work you 14 hours a day, but I'll feed you. And for Shin, this was unbelievable luxury. He could work for, from dawn till dusk plus a little bit after that, but then he could sleep. One of the big problems about the camp is it's very hard to sleep because you worked all day and then you went to meetings of self-criticism into the evenings, so you slept 4, 5, 6 hours at the most. For the first time when he crossed that border, the Chinese farmer also went to a pharmacy and got some medicine for his legs, because his legs were suppurating from those burns, and they began to heal. And he also started to bathe regularly, which was a completely new experience. And he got rid of the body lice he'd had since infancy. So he worked there for just a few months. That farmer took him to a cattle rancher farther up in the mountains, farther away from the border, and he worked there for a year, about a year. And that rancher cheated him, did not pay him what he said he would be paid, but he paid him something. Shin took the money, and during that time he was living in the cattle ranch. The other people there, this was farther into China, and people really didn't speak much Korean, so he learned some Chinese, but he also listened to the radio. They had a radio, and he'd never listen to a radio. So a radio was an incredible thing, and the Chinese weren't so interested in it because they watched TV or something. But he listened to Radio Free Asia and other stations coming out of Seoul aimed at the North Korean market. It was basically counter-propaganda kind of broadcasting. He listened to that every day, a couple hours a day, and he learned a lot. A lot was incomprehensible for him because he had no context for understanding. But he learned that there are churches inside China, there are Korean churches inside China. He learned that those who found their way to South Korea could do very well. They could get government funding, housing, care, that sort of thing. So he basically began to construct a plan for how to survive in the future. And his plan was basically to get farther away from the border where there are Chinese police that quite often repatriate people, particularly if they fall out with the people who are paying them nothing to work. So he moved away from the border. He rode buses to Beijing and to several other cities. They're all listed in the book. And then he found his way south by bus to Shanghai. And he met, by chance, a South Korean who took him to the consulate, the South Korean consulate in Shanghai. Put his arm around him, walked him into the consulate. And when he was there, he had diplomatic sanctuary. And he stayed there for 6 more months, bathing, eating better than he ever had before. And then he flew to South Korea via Manila, arriving in the summer of 2006, late summer 2006. So that's how he got there. And when he arrived, he was a psychiatric basket case. He held it together, all the stress. But once he got there, he went to a place called Hanawon, which is a resettlement center where all North Koreans go. And he began to have nightmares, and he couldn't sleep, and he went into a psychiatric hospital for a period of time. And medication and began to help with that. And when I met him, he was still a very emotionally strange person. He's much better now. He seems to have exponential growth in emotional, intellectual maturity as the years go by. As I said, he's really smart. Yes?
How does China benefit in its relationship with North Korea?
That's a good question. In some ways, I'm not sure I understand how China benefits from having this nutcase on its border and the criticism that goes with it. But what most analysts say, there are a couple reasons. One is that a U.S. allied, united Korean peninsula with 75 million Koreans, all aligned with the United States, right on its border, a border that has lots of ethnic Koreans on the Chinese side, is something that China doesn't want. So they want a buffer, some sort of a puppet state, a vassal state that they could use to protect themselves and to diffuse U.S. influence. So that's one theory. Another theory is that the collapse of North Korea would bring tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people from the 16th century, more or less, people who live in the dark at night, into China in an uncontrolled, destabilizing rush. I'm not sure that's true either, but that's said to be one of the considerations. I must have interviewed 200 experts on this subject from South Korea and the United States. Most of them think that there is now a split in China. As time goes by, there are new generations of Chinese leaders. And there's a sort of a 50-50. Maybe the Kim family is more trouble than it's worth, or maybe it's worth it and we'll put up with it. There also is an economic interest. North Korea sits on about $1 trillion worth, this is the South Korean government estimate, of valuable minerals. Iron ore, molybdenum, other metals that are used in aerospace manufacturing, which China is entering in a big way, trying to build their own aircraft, commercial as well as military. So they get good prices on that stuff. And there's also the labor market. If Kim Jong-un, the new leader, would open up South Korea to Chinese factories could make a lot of money there because salaries are so low compared to what they're paying now in China. And so those are the various reasons. But it is for China, as periodic shellings of islands, sinkings of ships, nuclear detonations, long-range missile launches, all of these things are not good business for China. So you could understand why they might be irritated with their state on the border. Other questions?
As you've described Shin thus far, and certainly for reasons that are very understandable, his motivations are very much related to benefiting himself.
Yes.
I'm wondering if he has, in your opinion, made any progress toward being motivated by any either cause larger than himself or to benefit another person.
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is yes. What he has done with his life is to focus it on raising awareness of the existence of the camps, to make people feel awful that it's still going on. That's what he wants to do. He wants to crawl inside the conscience of the world and make people aware that this horrible situation goes on. And I think he's under no illusions that it will change, that there are many levers on North Korea, because it's already sanctioned to a farthing well, and it has this patron China that keeps it alive. But he wants it to be part of any conversation going forward, the human rights issue. And he says that he can't marry, and he can't have kids, he can't go to school, he can't do anything until this changes. And my view is that he genuinely believes that, but he doesn't necessarily need to sacrifice so much. I think he could move on. As you can see from the pictures of him, he's a handsome guy, and he can be very funny and charming, and he's so smart that he has a great future in virtually everything. And so I wish, my personal wish, and I think I've told him, but he never listens to me, is move on, get a life, but he hasn't so far. Okay.
What you presented here is a very interesting thing about, obviously, the situation in North Korea. Could you make some comparisons about maybe East Germany, West Germany, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the blending of the two countries at that time?
Yeah.
What will be some of the challenges that we'll be facing, not only South Korea, but the Western world and even China, elaborating a little more about some of the issues that are going to be presented when the North Korea at some point folds?
The South Koreans they've paid a lot of attention to what happened when East Germany disappeared into a unified Germany. They have gone and studied it. They've studied the cost. They've studied the techniques. They have there's something called the Ministry of Unification in South Korea, which is a big bureaucracy that is devoted to making this happen at some future date. And the cost estimates are astronomical. What the numbers, I've heard various numbers over the years, but the South Koreans believe that it would cost them more as a percentage of their economy than what it cost Germany. And that cost was very considerable, in part because East Germany, compared to North Korea at the time of unification, if you compare that East Germany to this North Korea, you know, it's like comparing Bethesda to, you know, a 14th century village in France or something like that. It's just, the East Germans had so much more going for them than what the North Koreans do. They are isolated, they have been brainwashed. One of the things that happens at Hanawon, and this is pretty illustrative, Hanawon, which is this resettlement center in South Korea where North Koreans go. They all go there, and they're all given a short course in how to be a member of the modern world. And one of the things they teach them is a history course on the history of the Korean Peninsula. And they usually begin it, the teacher says, with great hesitation, now you know that it was North Korea that invaded the South to start the Korean War. And all of the North Koreans in class start shouting that that's impossible. That's not what they were taught. That's impossible. That's, you know, the whole reason why they are a tormented country is because American bastards and South Korean bitches went after them in the Korean War, and that's how it started. And so that is sort of like one of the many ways in which they are problematic in a unification scenario. You're going to have lots of problems, and just basic literacy now is beginning to fade in much of North Korea because of collapsed schools. The US intelligence community has estimated that a significant percentage of people who've grown up, come of age in the past 15 years are cognitively impaired because of childhood malnutrition, infant malnutrition. So that's also an incredible concern. But having said all that, also South Korea itself, the popular will in South Korea is unification is great, but not now. And maybe not in my lifetime, because they know it would be expensive and complicated. It would cut into growth. And South Korea, if I were a North Korean going to South Korea, it's almost impossible to overstate how difficult it is for them to fit in. It's very hard to overstate how difficult it is for South Koreans to fit in. The OECD, which is this group that monitors statistics on the developed countries in the world, they have all these statistics about the unique quality of stress in South Korea. A few of those numbers. South Koreans kill themselves at a much higher rate than anybody else in the OECD. They work more hours. They sleep fewer hours. They spend more time online. They spend less time recreating. And the list goes on and on and on. It is a very, very achievement-obsessed, education-obsessed culture. And the idea of uniting with the 14th century is just, it's just absurd to young people there who are trying to carve out a life for them. They also spend more time in cram schools and learning English than just about anybody else in the world. So they have grown so far apart in a metaphorical sense as cultures that unification, there's no real parallel, historical parallel for what would be at stake. My thought is that the most likely scenario, one that suits the interest of China, South Korea, Japan, and the United States at this point, is a kind of slow manufacturing invasion from China, where North Koreans find jobs that pay real salaries so they can import real food and get rid of the biggest human rights problem in the country, which is hunger. And that is probably the best scenario in the near future for that to happen. After that, then the Vietnam scenario, or even the China scenario, looking 2 or 3 decades ahead. It's possible that Kim Jong-un would be open to that as the new leader, is 28, new generation. It's possible, but who knows? If Kim Jong-un has a brain in his head, it's just not known at this point.
Hi. You mentioned earlier that Shin learned some Chinese while he was living in China. What language did you conduct your interviews in? Did he learn English? Did you learn Korean?
That's a
and
good
if you had a
question.
translator, was it like one dedicated translator, or did you have to like cycle through a few because
Yeah,
he's a little
that's a
unstable?
very good question, and it was a very big problem. My language skills, I've been a foreign correspondent a good part of my career, and I'm not good in foreign languages. I've studied many languages, but never mastered any. And Shin does not want to learn English, although he is so smart he could. So we had translators. And he frequently doesn't like his translators. He gets angry at them, and he thinks that they're out to get him sometimes. And so my first translator, who was my translator who worked for the Washington Post in Seoul, he wanted nothing to do with her at all. So I couldn't deal with him until she quit. And then I got a couple others. But what really happened was when he moved to Southern California, he befriended a Korean-American family whose son, David Kim, the great David Kim, as I refer to him, David Kim went to Yale. And David Kim is just about as smart as Shin is, if not smarter. And David Kim was home from Yale, waiting to go to law school in the summer of 2010, when I started my interviews down there in Torrance. And David Kim wanted Shin's story told. He speaks, idiomatic American English. His parents don't speak English much, so he grew up translating from almost from infancy for his family. So translating comes to him like mother's milk. In fact, I found in our days together in Southern California, I thought that I spoke Korean because he was such a good translator. And it was in that atmosphere of trust, and David Kim loved Shin. And in that atmosphere of trust and love, I was sort of allowed into the circle of what was important to Shin, and that's when he told me that he lied. And it was the miracle of this young man. Journalism is a very collaborative thing, and it wouldn't have happened without David Kim. Yes?
In a way, you sort of answered my question. So, considering all the situation that he's been through, how can we, we, us, or the whole world itself, can help him particularly? You say he's learning how to love and trust and having more normal life, I would say. How can we help him, or since you know him better, how do you think would be like the best help for him? Also he had to work eventually, or make his own life, like you were saying. So how can we help? And another thing is, I know it's very hard, the situation with North Korea, but what can be done to, make some conscience and, solve the situation?
Yeah, I know. Since this book came out and I've been talking about it, that question has been asked a lot by people here and in Europe where we've gone. And, I don't have a very good answer to that. North Korea, as I said, is in this position where it can strike back in a horrifyingly violent way if it's messed with militarily. And our leverage on China to lean on North Korea to change its ways to get rid of these camps is limited. I think that what can be done is to make sure that human rights is part of any conversation that the U.S. government has with China going forward on all issues, not just North Korea and the nukes and the missiles, but to make that a part, make that a constant irritant to China in conversations going forward. And that hasn't been done. And honestly, I don't think it's very likely that pragmatic State Department people would do that. But if public awareness increases about the camps and about the human rights atrocity that goes on, And people, presidential candidates, members of Congress are forced to have a position on this, that would make a difference. You know, in other countries, public opinion, like in Ethiopia, there was a big famine in the 1980s. Public saw pictures of starving children, and within 2 weeks there was a mountain of food in Ethiopia because of public opinion. This problem is not amenable to that kind of solution, but public opinion can have an effect over a long period of time. Sorry, it's not a very good answer, but it's the only one that I can come up with. Yes?
My question is about his education. He was, I understand, educated in Switzerland for several years.
Kim Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un. Now, two questions about that. One is, what is the intention of his fathers to send him to outside of North Korea, and particularly to the Europe? The second one is, how do you think his education in Switzerland would affect his thinking of the future of his own life and country, and the country's relationship with the outside of North Korea?
Well, that's an easy one to answer. I have no idea. I hope that being in Switzerland will make him a better person, but I just don't know. He wasn't there that long. He left when he was relatively young. And what he thinks, I mean, a lot of information is known about North Korea now, because there are 23,500 defectors living in Seoul who do talk, living in South Korea and mostly around Seoul. So a lot more is known about the texture of life in North Korea. What is not known is the inner workings of the government, who's in charge, what they think, what their characters are. It's speculation. And I did not work on that issue very much. I tried to deal with things that were more amenable to finding out. I just